Hi. Analog Heat plus FX is a stereo effects processor from Elektron. It may look like the Mark II, and it has the same 8 analog warmth and character circuits, but it now comes with 7 new digital effects and many more modulation options, transforming it into a comprehensive effects box and sound design tool. You can use it as an end-of-chain mastering tool, but more interestingly, to completely transform instruments you send into it. In this video, I'll take a look at the differences between Analog Heat plus FX and the relatively recent Analog Heat Mark II, all of its new effects compared to the Mark II, its Overbridge integration, a few tips on how you can use its modulation sources to create entirely new effects within it, and pros and cons overall. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Elektron sent Heat plus FX over for review. No money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded mainly by viewers who subscribe to exclusive content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Okay, let's start with a quick comparison for those of you familiar with the Analog Heat Mark II, and if you're not, no worries, I'll cover everything in here in detail in just a bit. The inputs and outputs for both are identical, and screen and knob colors notwithstanding, they both have the same number of buttons and overall panel layout. They also both have the same analog heat character circuits. Also, in terms of functionality, the knobs and buttons from the screen down do the same thing. What's been added in Heat plus FX are 7 new digital effects modules. You can edit these individually and set their order up any way you like. So, say, for example, if I want the delay to be at the beginning of the chain, it's easy to make that happen. The digital effects can also be on either side before or after the analog heat module, which itself you can move around to anywhere you want in the signal chain. You don't have to use all the effects, you can disable them pretty easily. The new digital effects are a delay, a bit crusher and sample rate reducer, warble, a tape effect, a digital compressor, a bass focus block or module, which can also be used as a general high and low cut filter, and then a stereo chorus and reverb. On the modulation side, you've got the good old envelope follower and LFO. 2 more LFOs have been added, and more importantly, almost all of the effects parameters have been added as destinations in the mod matrix. So all the individual effect parameters. The functions of the 4 buttons to the left of the screen have been changed to allow for easier access to all the features. The Heat button now consolidates both the amp section and the filter and EQ section, and it also has a brand new page for the gate feature, for the noise gate feature. Then the envelope and LFO buttons have also been consolidated into the mod menu. Like in the original Analog Heat, by the way, the LFOs can also be used as envelopes. Okay, so those are the big differences. Let's step back and take a look at what we've got here. The flow screen is kind of like the home page. The home screen shows you the effects, their order, and which are enabled or disabled. Disabled effects have a dotted outline, and yes and no quickly enables and disables effects. This screen also shows you important level meters on the inputs and on the outputs. When you're on all the other screens, then these show you input levels, and this little icon will trigger if the envelope triggers. I'll talk about that later. Then on any given page, you'll typically see when the effect is active an animation that shows more or less what's going on with that effect, and 4 parameters that you can control with these encoders. Sometimes effects have 1 page, and sometimes they'll have 2. Let's say, for example, the reverb. So this is page 1. This is page 2 of the reverb. You can also cycle between 2 pages of a module by pressing the button again, depending on which module you're on. And when you're on the flow page, you can dive into an effect by hitting yes. You can't go back by hitting no. It would be good if they added that. And then when you hold flow, you can edit the dry wet mix levels for all the modules, the ones on top or the ones on the bottom. So Say if in this case the bit crusher effect was crushing it too much, I could lower it, or if I wanted to hear the reverb, I could bring that up through here without having to dive into the module and find the amount knob. A bit more about the workflow. I already mentioned that the 4 knobs control the 4 effects on the bottom. If you press a knob in, you can change its parameters quickly. And if you hold settings and turn a knob, then its changes will be quantized. So all of the 7 digital effects are managed this way. The analog heat effect gets its own dedicated controls on the bottom side of the panel for the most part, though there are some parameters that you can only access in the menus here. For example, the dirt control and frequency panning, or mod depths. To complete the overview, you've got tempo controls, and you can have it externally synced if you like. You've got up to 512 presets on board, a few factory presets, and you can create your own, of course. And if you like, you can bypass the entire effect using the active button. In terms of connectivity, you've got a headphone output 1/4 inch, 2 balanced 1/4 inch outputs, and 2 balanced 1/4 inch inputs, 2 expression and foot switch pedal inputs, which also work with CV signals, MIDI in, out, and through, and USB, which sends MIDI back and forth. You can also use this as a class-compliant audio interface, and most importantly, also talks with Overbridge, which is a software app that lets you control and use Elektron products as if they were a plugin in your software or as standalone apps. What I particularly like about Overbridge is that it sends audio back and forth over USB without requiring you to add analog heat plus effects as an audio interface to your computer or as an aggregate device. So you keep using whatever audio interface you're used to using. You don't need to tie up the inputs and outputs on it to send audio in here and send it back out. Everything just goes back and forth over USB, which I think is a very important convenience. That said, if you don't have an audio interface, you can use this as one. A final word about the setup, analog heat plus effects, and I'm going to start calling it heat plus effects so this video clocks in under an hour. Anyway, it's a stereo processor. I'll be using one mono input in this video to make it easier to hear the stereo impact of the effects, and modulation tricks will play here, but you can plug in and process a stereo source into heat, and each side will be processed separately. So effectively, certainly on the analog side, you've got really 2 copies of each of these character circuits, the filters, the EQs, 2 of each, 1 per each side. Okay, let's dive into the details. Since some of you may have already heard Heat's analog character circuits in action, let's start with the digital effects first, and then I'll go through the Heat circuits and options and talk about a few things I don't see mentioned much. One more administrative bit of business. You always want to set input sensitivity to as close as possible to maximum without being told it's too high. So that's good enough for this. So let's disable all of these and start with bits, a combo sample rate reduction and bit rate reduction processor. So this is the sample rate redux and bit rate reduction, which adds a lot of gain as it and if you don't want this insanity happening across the frequency spectrum, you've got a filter, which in combination with the dry wet control can make things a little bit more subtle. Let's move on to the Warble module. So this is all dry. Let's go all wet. You've got stereo width control, and then Warble speed and depth. So you can go pretty crazy here, and there's also a noise level and filtering for the noise. And I think what's particularly nice here is that, yes, you can make it warble, which can be extreme, but you can also filter that. So let's isolate the effect just to the highs, using a high-pass filter with the bass width filter, and then bring back a bit of the original dry sound. That adds a bit of warble, say on the highs. Let's try that maybe on the lows. So it adds character without completely messing up everything. So that's warble. Let's try the chorus next. Let's start with all dry. And with chorus. That's the chorus. There's only one page here. Pretty nice. Let's move on and take a look at the delay. This naturally works best when tempo synced. And I've got that going on here via MIDI. Like I mentioned earlier, you can quantize times. There's ping pong mode, stereo width, which you can increase, feedback control, which very clearly shows you it's going to go wild. And then on page 2 here, you've got a bass width filter for the feedback loop. And then you've got 3 mix modes or effect amount modes. The first is send, which will keep the buffer going in send mode. And you control if you're sending audio to it. So I could stop this entirely, and you'll still hear the buffer go on. And then the other mode is return mode. The level of what's going on in the buffer. And then finally you've got a mix, dry wet mix mode. Next up, let's listen to the reverb module. Let's go with this pattern. So this is the dry signal. Let's turn on the reverb. Sounds really nice here. As welcomed in Elektron devices, decay goes to infinity. You've got shelving control, or basically filtering, for the feedback loop, the reverb feedback. You've got another bass width filter for audio sent to the reverb effect. And here too, like the delay effect, is one of my favorite features, and that's the 3 send, return, and mix modes. So the mix mode is pretty much par for the course for any effect. You've got control over the dry and wet mix. But where things get really interesting are the send and return modes. In the send mode, you control how much of your audio is sent to the reverb feedback buffer. So I could freeze the buffer, stop sending it audio, and then control its return level in the mix, and play on top of that, play on top of the frozen audio. And as long as the send amount is at 0, nothing will be added to the frozen reverb. Let's move on and talk about the compressor module. You've got 2 pages here. Probably the most important thing to do is get the compression into the mix. And then you've got threshold for gain reduction. And you can see the gain reduction kick in over here. You'll typically want to apply makeup gain to compensate for the gain reduction. You've got control over attack and release, how quickly the compressor kicks in. Yeah, it's pretty aggressive, lower threshold, and fast attacks means more aggressive compression. Ratio controls the extent of gain reduction. And the sidechain filter controls which frequencies get sent to the compressor to trigger the compressor. And one of the things that would have been nice here would have been automatic gain compensation to help fine-tune the settings. One of the cool things about Heat Plus effects is that aside from the compressor effect module, you can create your own compressor pointing to multiple other parameters beside gain using the envelope follower. More on that in a bit. Next up, the bass focus module. The stated purpose of this module is to let you correct phasing issues by converting the low-end portion of your audio to mono, and you control which low-end portion using this knob. It does a couple of other things, but let's test its stated goal. So as long as this dot is near the 1, you don't have any phasing issues. Since I'm sending it a mono source, that kind of makes sense, but let's maybe try and mess things up a bit with a stereo delay. And let's maybe also turn on the reverb. So we've created a bit of a mess, but no phasing issues as long as this dot isn't shifting below 0. But if we did want to correct, let's say that we did have an issue, just turn the bass from stereo to mono. And now everything below the crossover point will be in mono. So now the entire signal is mono. And now just the low end. Now aside from this, you can lower each side, so essentially it becomes like a high-pass filter now. A pretty sharp cut. Or low-pass filter. Okay, let's talk about, and more importantly, listen to the character circuits. If you're familiar with the circuits of Analog Heat Mark II, feel free to jump right ahead to the gate section of the timeline on the left. Whenever dealing with heat, make sure you're coming in just hot enough, but not too hot. And I'm going to start with sine waves from MicroFreak, because all audio is essentially made of sine waves. And it's a great way to see on the scope what can happen to one frequency, or in this case, maybe one frequency in a bit as it gets distorted. So this is our raw tone. Let's listen to the clean boost circuit from very little drive all the way to when it starts clipping. You can further drive a circuit into the filter, by the way, by adding dirt. And no worries, we'll get to more musical examples in a bit, but I think it's really interesting to look at the harmonics generated from one simple sine wave here. So that's the first clean boost circuit. Let's move on to the saturation circuit. And you can both see and hear how this sounds different with dirt as well. Let's move on to the enhance circuit. With dirt, mid-drive. From clean, with dirt, rough crunch, classic distortion. Let's move on to round fuzz. And finally take things to 11 or 12 with high gain. Let's quickly cycle through these with different types of audio. Clean boost, no dirt, saturation, enhance, mid-drive, rough crunch, classic distortion, round fuzz, high gain. Let's try something more acidic. Clean boost. Saturation. Enhance. Mid-drive. Rough crunch. Classic distortion. Round fuzz. And high gain. And let's try a guitar loop. Moving on, in the heat block, audio gets passed from the circuits through dirt into the analog filters. So let's take a listen to them. Let's start maybe with a low pass filter first. Quite a boost there in bass as well, with resonance. Nice crunch there. Turning up resonance doesn't impact bass too much, by the way. Maybe a bit. So that's the 12 dB per octave slope. Let's try out the 6 dB per octave slope. And for the rest, let's maybe pass this noise. So, bandpass filter with resonance. High pass, both 6 dB and 12 dB per octave options. Band reject or notch filter. Resonance will impact the cut. And peak. Very subtle without resonance, but substantial with. So that's nice, but a multi-mode filter isn't cool. You know what's cool? 2 multi-mode filters in stereo. So this is where the frequency panning parameter comes in. You've got 2 filters, left and right, and this determines the stereo spread. And then the filter cutoff knob moves both those peaks together. And we'll modulate this later for a really nice effect. You can disable the filters, by the way, if you like, by pressing these 2 buttons. And after the filters, you've got EQ, which is a little bit different per circuit. Let's maybe listen to these just a bit. Nice bass boost and highs. One of the things I wish they'd show you here on all the screens is if you're clipping, you always need to watch gain levels. You need to go out to the flow screen to see that. And if you see 1 or 2 exclamation points, you'll want to address that by reducing drive levels. I think in this circuit it's kind of impossible. And when all else fails, just reduce the overall output level of the circuit. Now, as you may have heard, some of these circuits pick up any little noise, especially this one. Luckily, there's a new gate circuit or page on the Heat circuit, and you simply set a threshold and the amount of ducking. So it could be a low threshold or not until you get enough of the noise out, and then you can continue to crush whatever you like, but the noise will stop when the audio does. You've also got hold and release parameters for this. So those are the effects. Let's talk about modulation and start with the envelope. At its core, the envelope, or the follower, is a modulation source that follows the level of incoming audio and generates an envelope, or a mod source, from those levels. However, there's way more under the hood than meets the eye. First, it can translate incoming audio levels into modulation in one of 3 different ways, which you choose using the mode knob. So there's regular follower mode, and then attack decay mode, and attack release mode. The most intuitive or easy to understand mode is follow mode. Let's get a loop going in here. And the first thing you'll want to do is set levels so that you see the entire dynamic range of your audio moving from top to bottom or bottom to top. Now I can take this mod source and send it to any one of the available mod destinations in the matrix. But to keep things simple, let's say take it to the filter because it has its own envelope knob, the low pass filter. Maybe add some resonance. And you may have noticed I now made a kind of wah effect. Now, aside from this, over in the envelope, I've got control over attack and release, which will smoothen out the envelope follower. A longer attack will make the envelope respond more slowly to increases in level. A longer release will make it decay more slowly. The 2 other modes, not follow, but attack decay and attack release, are slightly more complex because they disconnect the audio as a source from the envelope that's coming out almost totally in terms of what the modulating envelope looks like. So if I bring up Overbridge, you'll notice that when I'm in follow mode, you see the envelope on the screen. It's sort of doing its thing, going up and down as a mod source based on the attack and release, just like the audio is. But notice that if I move it to either attack decay or attack release, that it totally dies down. Nothing is going on with the envelope except when it hits the trigger. So let's see how that works. I'm going to lower this down again so we see the entire range. And notice when it reaches this line on top, it triggers a wah, and I can reduce the trigger level so that we get more trigger events for that wah effect, for the attack decay envelope. And you can see that over on Overbridge or on the filter page, by the way. Just need to go back and forth between the 2. Triggers that. And you'll notice this little icon light up when there's a triggered event. Attack decay envelopes simply go all the way up based on the attack speed and immediately down based on the release speed. And attack release envelopes will stay open for as long as the follower audio is above the trigger threshold. So hopefully that helps explain the follower, the resulting envelope, triggers, and you can also trigger triggers manually by holding yes and pressing mod. Now, where I think this gets really interesting is when you start pointing the envelope to different destinations. So for example, here I've got it pointed to the filter frequency panning. So what the envelope follower or the envelope is doing now is triggering panning events based on transients in the source audio and the follower audio, creating rapid back and forth panning swooshes, which I think sounds very interesting. Another fun thing I explored. Here we've got the envelope quite excessively intentionally modulating the filter reverb amount with a negative mod depth. So by default, the reverb is on. This is what zero modulation sounds like. Just everything washed in reverb. And then if I modulate the reverb amount down, it makes way for the kick like sidechain. Whenever the envelope follower crushes the trigger, and I get this nice effect. And I can make it more refined by changing the release and attack parameters. So it's less noticeable like this, and obviously more noticeable creates a pumping-like effect. I think it would be nice if there was a way to see the outgoing envelope without pointing it to the filter. Obviously you can see it on Overbridge. Another cool idea is to duck an endless feedback loop. Let me explain the concept. In this patch, I play a note and it gets sent to an endless feedback loop in the delay buffer. But what I want to have happen is that when I play a new note, since I don't want the audio to get too messy, I want new notes to duck out previous notes. So as long as I don't play anything, the loop should go on forever. But if I play a new note, then I want to gradually reduce the level of whatever was previously in the feedback loop. So now this loop is going to play forever, which makes me wish for a longer feedback loop in here, a longer delay line basically. So this will keep going until I play something new, which will duck the level of the previous loop to make way for new audio content in the loop. So the way this works is pretty simple. I'm using the good old envelope follower, and it's modulating feedback down as it detects new incoming audio. So you can see its envelope here, and what I'm doing is sending it with a negative mod depth to the feedback parameter of the delay to modulate it down. So it quiets down the delay feedback when a new note comes in, which I think is pretty cool. And when you want the cacophony to die down, just go into the delay effect and turn feedback down manually. One final cool aspect about the envelope follower, you also have a filter for what causes its audio to respond. So basically, let's maybe start up a loop again. And maybe let's go for a regular basic compressor. So now we're modulating the amp level, but we could modulate any other destination. Anyway, I could choose to only have this compression effect be triggered by high frequency transients. So you can see the kick isn't triggering compression, but the snare is. Or I can have it work the other way around. Just have the kick trigger compression and not the snare. Let's move on to the LFOs. There are 3 of them. They can be either tempo synced to the BPM or not in different multiples. So you can have this knob control different ranges. You've got the standard waveforms we've come to expect. You can change the start phase of these, and you can also have them fade out, fade in, and trigger once, basically turn them into envelopes based on trigger events from the envelope follower. So let's maybe look at a few examples. I've prepared a little Tremolo style effect. Go into the LFOs, choose the shape. Let's maybe go for this. could obviously change the shape. Let's maybe try one more patch I created, stereo peaks. So this is sending LFO 1 to the filter frequency panning. Two filters in peak mode. And you know, you can obviously play with the rate to taste. If you want, you can go nuts into audio rates. Just to round out modulation, you've got a mod matrix. This lets you point the envelope to another destination beside what it's pointed to in the other page, or the filter frequency. And then same for the LFOs, 1, 2, and 3, an additional destination. And then you can also point the CV inputs and expression pedal inputs to any of the available effect destinations. So a lot to play with here. Okay, before we head out to the pros and cons, let's take a quick look at the Overbridge app and plugin. Like I mentioned earlier, you can stream audio back and forth just using USB, and this works in parallel to your audio interface. You don't need to create aggregate devices, which can cause syncing problems. A brief overview of the plugin: you've got 2 tabs, the preset editor and general settings. Then on top, you've got the various effects. You can scroll left and right to view them. This, for example, is the heat block. Any change I make here will be reflected in the plugin, and vice versa. Oops. On the instrument itself, changes that I make here, say to EQ, will be reflected in the plugin, and I can change the parameters here. You won't turn the knobs, obviously, but if I go into the EQ settings here, then you'll notice this will turn as I move the mouse on the screen. And then on the bottom portion, you can view the follower, the envelope, the gate, trigger, and 3 LFOs, which can be quite a mess, but useful, obviously, if you want to troubleshoot something, isolate it, and see what's going on behind the scenes. If you load Overbridge into your DAW, you can automate all of Heat's parameters and essentially have it behave like any other plugin in your system, which works nicely whether you're using it as an effect or as part of a mastering workflow. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for analog Heat Plus effects. As always, the pros and cons should be considered in light of the alternatives. Now, there are plenty of other multi-effects out there which will give you distortion, delays, reverbs, and other effects, both at higher and lower prices. There are a few things that make analog Heat Plus effects stand out, I think. On the character or distortion side, it's the ease with which you can audition and explore different distortion types, along with how gain and parallel processing impacts their character, especially in light of the sheer number of hands-on controls it has dedicated to messing around with the character circuits and really playing them as if they were an instrument. On the digital effects side, first, in my opinion, the effects here sound really good, otherwise it would be a non-starter, but more importantly, it's the modulation options in here that make this box, I think, truly stand out. Now, there is a bit of a learning curve coming to grips with the different envelope modes, what follow, what attack decay, what attack release means. Hopefully I explain that well in this video. But once you start to feel comfortable with this, the creativity that this opens up makes Heat Plus effects, I think, more like a flexible modular setup than a regular multi-effects box. And I think that Heat Plus effects is a particularly good companion for a synth that doesn't have internal effects. Then the final standout feature, I think, for Heat Plus effects is Overbridge, which was in beta at the time that I was testing this, but assuming that the issues that I saw were ironed out, the ease with which Heat Plus effects can be integrated into a hybrid setup with a computer is unparalleled at this price range. Just plug in a USB cable and you're good to go. So those are the pros. On the cons side, first, in terms of the hardware, probably the biggest thing that I would have liked to see here is more inputs, and at the very least the option to use the 2 inputs for 2 different instruments with basic level and panning controls. The competition for this isn't just multi-effects boxes, I think, but it's also mixers with built-in effects. Then the second thing that would have been nice would be 4 more knobs to control effects that have 2 pages. So rather than paging left and right, like all Elektron devices, just give us 8 knobs to control 8 parameters at once. Now, obviously you can't add knobs here, but while these animations are nice, I'd like a pro mode where, kind of like how in the flow page, you hold flow and you can edit 4 parameters at once, and then choose different parameters. It would be nice, I think, to see all 8 parameters, say of the delays or the reverbs, all of them at once on one page. I can do without this animation, and then maybe double tapping the buttons would swap control between the upper 4 parameters and the bottom 4 parameters. Another feature I hope they add is level indicators on a per effect basis and on the flow screen. So right now you see levels on the input and on the output, and say on the compressor as an individual module, which is nice. But you don't see that anywhere else. You used to be able to see that, by the way, on analog Heat MK2 on the heat screen, on this screen. Right now you just get this animation. Again, I'd much rather have level meters here, and on other modules, maybe on the top of the screen, this shows you inputs, but I'd like to see inputs into the module and outputs from the module. And that's because some of these modules can add quite a bit of heat. For example, the bits module can get pretty crazy. Same goes for even gentler modules like the delay or reverb. You can get quite a bit of extra gain from these, which can result in clipping. Anyway, the goal would be to be able to quickly see which module is causing levels to clip, as opposed to diving into the modules one by one and seeing which one is causing an issue or holding flow and kind of trying to mess with levels to see which one is giving us a hard time. Then finally on my wish list, it's a lot of fun using the delay as a looper. Obviously, ideally we'd get a looper module, but as a second best, it would be nice to extend the delay times to over 2 seconds. So that's it for Analog Heat Plus Effects, the most fun I've had with a multi-effect. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more, including a whole chapter about envelope followers in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.